The Owl by John Hawkes. Part 2. The Prisoner Comes.
Permetta le presenti mia figlia. Permetta le presenti mia figlia Antonina. It was the feeling in Sassofeltore that after this introduction she, be she Teresa or Antonina, would say, "Quando potrò rivederla," hiding hair and throat in a tight veil. During the warm weather they stood out on the rocks to watch, a young woman standing white as the Donna upon each stone below the cliff. The romantic gambados of all such as Signor Barabo, these aging courtiers, tempered the season and the cockle cap, the red noses, turned to home greatly astir. The devil sat between Signor Barabo's shoulders and breathed heat down his neck. There was an air about Sassofeltore. It was felt in the council, near the pump, or behind a stained glass, that one wretched mass of the sex was about to rise to the temptation. What one of them did not expect to husband my prisoner? Signora Barabo, with fiery arms, bathed her daughters in an alcove behind the farmhouse, and the water ran from under the bristling swine, seeping across the yard from the bath. First little Ginevra, and then Antonina, sparing neither, the shouts of the three women loud as slaves naked in their stockade. And not a word from Antonina when, accompanying her father, she carried pressed to her bosom a book from whose foot hung a flower, the spinster's needle, hardly moving under the clasp of her hand. In Sassofeltore, female fingers were powdered and ringed, were driven carelessly into dough or the common crush of blood apples, or took the axe to the pig. It was at this time of the bath one day, when the owl also spit and picked his front, that my ward Pacento led a small column of soldiers, and amid them the prisoner, up the hangman's road. Pacento, the lictor, was well ahead, and he was covered with the camouflage of torn coat, beretta, and dusty face. Pacento led his band past the girls' shifts drying on the barbed wire, and forward to the steeper grade. At the same moment Signora Barabo splashed Antonina from the bucket. Pacento brandished the Roman fasces over his head. The bundle of straw and the scythe blade, arms of authority, these he kept thrusting left to right at the open road, so that the rushes whistled and the blade hooked into the air. It was an instrument he might shake at the path of a fiend, or rattle on the day of excoriation. Every few feet, Pacento, still on his toes, suddenly crashed the jacketed axe head down upon the earth savagely as he could. I felt also his extravagance, and I, too, the compulsion in his various steps, and as this small figure flexed his legs, his arms, even from the tower I could see that he was capable of cutting down the bush and huts as he passed. The marchers that he led huddled together and tramped up the hill. They had been joined by 1, 2 members of that outermost patrol whose skulls were cavernous, and whose muskets were covered with the bleach of bare collarbones. They walked heavily and clung to earth, often making a cordon out of their arms, knapsacks, and blackened eyes. Their greatcoats billowed and exposed the home-sewn sleeping shirts, grained with lice. A rifle raised. I saw the black expulsion of shot and ball signaling their arrival. They had come far. Still, close as they were to the end of the march, they crowded together, menacing their prisoner as if they could not bear to give him up. A small child ran from a sty and threw grit into the midst of spiked boots, perspiration, and white lips. It was not long before those few figures, old and bent out in the fields, accustomed as they were to till from light to dark without looking up from the furrow, so alike and so menial they could not be picked out from the clay and pinch of seed they attempted to sow, dropped their rakes. From several corners they hurried toward the road, to stare after the band, smelling of the capture. A foreign crow glided above them and watched for refuse. An old man shouted, "Come si chiama?" Come si chiama? Excitedly, squeezing his hands. But if the prisoner understood, he dared not answer. The wind tore to shreds the clouds about me. The taste of morning coffee and cognac was on my tongue, and so high on the fortress walk one could hardly imagine the burnished air and the moisture that lay in the beds of the bullocks at the foot of the valley. The rooks cowered in their nests. A spirit bottle had smashed on the stones in this deserted niche of the fortress, and back and forth my boots ground the glass. It was a cold, vigilant place. As I watched the progress of Pucento and his patrol, my mind measured off the fields like parallel rules. 100 kilos would be reaped from that one, another 100 from that. In the middle field there was nothing except the grave of a peasant's small boy. The earth looked like the mud holes of rice flats. It stretched away only to provide a surface in which to hide excrement. On the eastern horizon, on the sea, a lone sail leaned down, skirting the salt caps. Then Pucento was nearer. They approached the gate that was proud only of its immunity after a past of doges, conservatories, learning, and brotheldom, the Renaissance driven from our garrets and streets. The foot soldiers were close, the green skullcaps, the rusted saber, the empty sacks. They disappeared into the arches and piazzas and the smell of burning twigs. I was spared the sight of the women holding their bosoms to the window in welcome. Sassofeltore gave them its unlatching of shutters, and they were followed by an old woman offering them a hot pullet. As the soldiers passed the coffin-maker's shop, the old fellow poured a drop of spumante into the tin cup of each and tried to detain them. "Where is your daughter, coffin-maker?" growled one, taking his draught and flattening his boots on the stone. "Inside, inside," was the quick answer, and, "Lucia, come down, daughter." But they were gone, and he drank a bit himself and sat upon the curb. Two children, dressed only in shirts, ran ahead and pounded on the doors, and their running feet sounded like a monkey clapping his hands. "La, la, la, la," were the exclamations within. They went through the streets, barely catching the pieces of bread and meat thrust at them, and they turned the corners all at once, like a band no longer familiar with avenues and pedestrian courtesies, took large strides, men just come from marching in the snow. They were conscious of the weapons, the powder bags hanging to their bodies. They were poorly shaved, having cut at their faces out of doors and in cold water. But even those in Sassofeltore had grey cheeks and oily hair, the marks of their Latin, circumspect temperament. Even Senor Barabo had inherited his weakness. And men, as well as women, appeared at the windows to wave stockings or a wooden fork, wiping the wine from their lips and sleep from their eyes. "Che cosa, cosa," whispered the very young until they were lifted to sea. Pucento led his men upward through Sassofeltore. From the roofs below me rose a crematorial smoke which they had fanned to fire in the middle of their stone floors early that morning. The first awake had shaken the second in his blanket, and then the third. With the confusion of dawn still upon them, they lifted dirty heads from their arms, and a vocabulary humble as the sounds of animals was put to use again. All of them wanted to touch the prisoner who had not a moment before been brought from the fields and ditches into the streets and bolted structures of Sassofeltore, past the sagging figure of Signor Barabo himself, gripping aloft a handkerchief and shouting, "Viva il prigioniero!" Even from the absolute clarity of my vantage above, the wind was strong enough to prickle one's skin but leave the eyes starting from the head. I surveyed the slate roofs, and beneath them those who hurried in anticipation through the morning. The band emerged from the edge of the city and faltered a moment upon the plateau of the last back houses and overtoppled fountain, shouldering their arms before crossing the graveyard from which started the paths to the fortress. The eager crowd did not follow them from under the pitch of roofs and balconies, but the women and children went indoors again. Two old men tipped their heads together. held their arms up in excited, tremor-boned salute, and went their separate ways, listening with their ears to the lock-holes for what was to come. Pucento thrust high the fasces, and twisted them around and around in helpless signal, unable to move further, paralyzed with wine. The others pulled their coat collars over their mouths. But even paralyzed, Pucento's standstill was tormented with the sound of dogs leaping with torches in their jaws, his indecision comic and fearful as a clown's. I leaned over the parapet. "Avanti!" I shouted, and at the command they rattled forward, striking their pennant staffs into the ruts. The owl hooted. The climbers, in their bulky clothes, tried to balance by clutching the blue and black scrub trees that twisted horizontally from the cliff. The hidden villagers sent up a low-lying olive smoke. Then I saw the prefect come out, finish his piece of dried pepper, hastily tuck his shirt into his trousers, and descend to meet the prisoner. He was short and wiry in the light. On his belt he carried a ring of keys, and in his hand a pair of wrought-iron pincers. He poked his sharp tongue against his cheek, thoughtfully. The ganders cut between the prefect and the prisoner. The birds, dragoons of the farmyard, precariously trod the sheer ledge, and continued unswervingly, keeping formation in unlikely crags and watches, pointing their sails, languid but regimented and stately despite webbed feet. White and silent was their propulsion. Between the prefect and Pucento, the ganders sailed with prohibitive bodies, the shape of vindictive Flemish women's headgear, wide and crackling beyond their backs. I stood tall, shoulders hard against the round of the high tower, surveying the radii of earth not quite a maremma. And far, far off, some low women beat their loaves upon an ox's haunch. All about was the deceptive blue sky. In, out, to the chest and extended, I breathed deeply of the air the wind hath frozen in his belly. I hardly noticed the black tiles on the roofs directly below, and did not know whether all were impassioned of the prisoner thinking he would escape the scaffold, or, more likely, thinking I would hang him. But I did not concern myself with the whispering women, or with the deceptive plans of Signor Barabo, nor with the prefect's temporary arrangements for the captive, for he existed only for this, the torture that demanded no strength from his own arms, the turn of ratchets and a blowing of bellows into live coals, his activity confined to the adjusting of his 4 hooks, a cunning that grew in the dark, that filled his lungs with the smut of burning hair and oil. But I would sooner my boots pick up fresh dung by the hour, the rain splatter my bald skull, the ice stiffen my red cape, and the dwarf trees lash my shoulders at a run, than sit bent over, afraid to injure my windpipe, studying the silent drops of moisture on the aquiline nose of one being garroted in a cellar thick as a furnace. Signor Barabo could recite the canticles. The hangman shall be 4 cubits tall or more, shall have a head of prominent bones and smooth on the top, so that all admire the irrevocable round of the bone and largeness of the brain, and he shall be bareheaded, except on each day preceding the Sabbath named in advance by the hangman, when he shall wear a pointed black cap, the better to see him, and to make the grimness of his nature apparent by contrast with the conical black peak, in the manner in which the fiercest animals are fashioned, with some unnatural largeness of hindquarters, stripes on their sides, or horn. Between the high tower and the low was a rampart of moss and stone, a catwalk connecting the two as stolid as a Roman battle mound. It led one at a level with the chimneys and unearthly shrubs. There was no handrail. Here the rock was soft and sloped toward the drop to the valley, narrow and red with the iron secreted in the crevices. I walked out upon the sledge. The wind swept it with his frost. As I moved, a large barren nest, insulated with old feathers, was suddenly flung into the air, where it hovered a moment, a round tangle of black briar, and, striking an invisible pit, fell down heavy as a demon's iron halo. The low tower barely held one man. I was able to look over its edge into the silence below. It was a mere turret fashioned from the silence of the fortress, protected from the wind, and covered with drops of moisture like the hollow of a tree trunk. To wait here and to watch, confined in the lookout overhanging the quiet court, made my crossed arms patient and the eyes dilate as through the gray of the dark. The stone that came to my chest hampered even the intake of breath, yet at that moment I might have already fallen, stepped into the beating air. The tall lady stood below in the court, almost as if she were taking the sun. Now she had no rope. Her place had been appointed by men who, with trepidation, paced off the earth and tasted it upon their knees under her shadow, a shadow taken to the earth and remaining there. The scaffold itself, shaped like a tool of castigation, was constructed to support the dead weight of an ox if we came to hang oxen. She was of wood and black as a black ark, calm by nature, conceived by old men with beards and velvet caps, simple and geometric as frescoes of the creation of the world. She offered no retraction or leniency once death was in motion. Much about Sassofeltore was told in the idleness of the gallows, and idle, without her tongue, how stolid, permanent, and quick she was, still ready as the roots of ancient speech for the outcry. Her shadow changed sides while I watched, and it became more cold. The sun did not come too close to her. Grace to you, hangman, shouted the citizens of Sassofeltore, and put flame to their torches, though it was still light. The faces in the crowd that formed on the swept cobblestones when the prisoner was hurried into the fortress, the faces whose noses, cheeks, foreheads, of a greedy man, sullen man, obedient man, choleric serf, struggled to free themselves from the caricature putty and paint of their daily look. There was a murmur, the press of the people, in expectation. If Signor Barabo had come upon me then, he would not have bothered with his long-practiced and formal "Permette che le presenti mia figlia," nor bothered to bow or hide the worn patch in his official cummerbund. He was flushed, and might only have shaken his head at the obvious color and fulsomeness of his daughter's arm. But he remained now behind closed doors in the cafe, and the glass before him was kept brimming. My eldest daughter, gentlemen, Antonina, has become the belle. Let us be bold. The word is appassionato. Already, sirs, I seek to hire 2 backs at least to carry the dowry, 2 more her gowns, and the rest of it. Let us call her respected bride, Donna, but we can agree every bone in her body is true. The knuckles are hard, the heart does not flutter needlessly. Put your coats down, gentlemen, for my daughter. She has been standing these 7 years, confident the while, in a pasture of chilly reeds, and not once has the wind spied her ankles. Have you seen them, gentlemen, the virgins touching each other's cheeks by the mill, or the lonely south creche? But, gentlemen, even the little girls titter when my daughter passes. The children suspect something, my friends. Will it be the white gown, or the gown the color of pearl, the embroidered linen, or the plain? Shall we order radiant dignity? Will we serve pheasant and fish, or goose? What sort of rings? I ask you to think of Antonina. There is Lucia also, signore. Yes, and of Lucia also, if I may ask it. Think, gentlemen, for your pleasure, and make your decisions. The baking must begin at once, for I tell you, the weddings will sweep us like grass fires. Senor Barabo rubbed his hands as if he were rolling a great ball of unleavened dough. The fathers of Sassofeltore raised the bowls to their lips and salute. A small lizard ran across the floor, and the coffin-maker reached out his boot and destroyed it against the beam. There were 2 narrow windows in the cafe, each filled with small, thick cubes of purple glass, sealed by lead into the frame, through which, thick, opaque, the street and the world beyond were dimmed. And out in the street thronged the crowd, a few grinning uncontrollably, rapped on the glass, an aimless communication of the drift of their mood. The emotion went among them, possessing their hands and feet, making them noisy. Those who had been asleep asked, "When did he come? Citizen, only one of them? When will we see him again?" Some, with uncomprehending eyes and jaws slack, shouted, "The hangman has taken his wife! He has taken his wife!" knowing not what they said. They put their hands upon Antonina, crying, "Fortunate, fortunate! She here will not have her purse for long." The women dropped combs from their hair. Now 2, now 3, fell from the crowd, and stood looking at each other with wonder. Senor Barabo's well-born eldest daughter, Antonina, was no more able than they to resist the street crowds. She walked in the direction of the Jesuits' chapel, but she did not enter it. She was reluctant, yet Antonina also was not to be denied, and climbed to the heights of Sassofeltore, as women will when they have heard of a disemboweling or other fascination. She did not shudder, seeing her sisters with the cloth off their shoulders. Antonina was one of the virgins who have grown knowledgeable as an old wife, select at nursing fires or calling back the dead with circles and chalk. Up she came through the rose campions and sourweed, having refused the accompaniment of little Ginevra, and the tears of the brisk wind were impersonal upon her cheeks, still olive with the pigment of generations. "Antonina, Antonina, this way!" hailed Signor Barabo from the door of the cafe, and waved the handkerchief he had lately shaken at the prisoner. His daughter gave him the rare crow's wing of her smile. "Gentlemen," shouted the father, "behold!" As they gathered behind him in the door-frame, a dozen pairs of eyes, and a dozen goblets. In a curious manner, with intoxicated bravado, and a fear lest the words not be said at all, Senor Barabo shouted his daughter's banns loudly, this each time incomplete. "Antonina, respected and beloved of father and mother, has become betrothed by law and by permission of her father, soul, spirit, and good temperament to Signore. Gather the white flowers, Antonina shall marry. It is declared, this woman's betrothal has been fixed on earth, and I, the father, I give her... And these speeches, he was clutched by his compatriots in the doorway, were addressed to the oglers nearest him, the red noses and scar cheeks of the women, who replied by opening their mouths as if hearing a proclamation of punishment instead of the banns. Then he freed himself and pushed away toward his daughter. "Will of the Donna that she marry, will of the Donna that she enter the rooms of the tall booted hunter. No daughter shall refuse to give herself, and her father asks it. All the public shall see her enter the stranger's house, none see her return. Begone to wedlock, then." He took her arm and stepped forward, bowing to the left and right, low, and the integument wriggled under the coat between his shoulders. Antonina was a head taller. "Un momento, per favore," muttered the coffin-maker, catching up with them, and pulling after him his daughter Lucia. The 2 pairs climbed the black and white streets. Black rings and bolts, white stones, once washed by the sanctimonious novitiates, now the wind whistled in them, preparatory to thundering down the mountain. The 2 old men held tight their virgins. Antonina, despite disbelief and the black band fastened about her throat, walked sternly a little in front of her father, hastening to see for herself. Her face was like the Donna's. Already she knew what propriety was lost, but Antonina's heart made public would perhaps put them to silence. Her mother, deftly, had pinned a small male figure of silver to her hip, and there it caught the sun. The red and the gold were gone from the fortress. Senor Barabo took his daughter in Puccento's late footsteps, grimacing as the shrubs slipped through his hands, and he tottered, wiping his face. The fortress was black and white with age. The rooks screamed the cry of a dying species. Senor Barabo stared up at the grated window of the fortress, and as soon as he got near, he bellowed, "My son-in-law, future son-in-law, look here!" stamping his foot and shaking his black hat in the evening, unconscious of the shadow at his side. I, on the other hand, took my usual ride that evening. Despite the disturbance among the people, the graveyard was still and softly grained as an etching. Since some had worked this day, I passed the trees still smoldering, the stunted pines whose roots they labored to destroy by burning. I rode across their farms and through the middle of Senor Barabo's villa as well. There were no signs of the young women waiting out upon the rocks. Perhaps their mothers were plying them with mulled wine. Certainly they were not teaching them any matter of weights and measures. Even the women of Sasso Fettori were acute in the practice of weighing sin in their hands, like a pound of oats, the sciences of law and balance being this twilight abandoned for the plates of the true lover's knot. I did not stop. My donkey trotted jangling past the very light from their windows, so close his hoofs shook the earth of their floors. But there was not a question of my dismounting, not a movement to detain me, though the donkey brushed the sides of their gates. One would hardly know what they were thinking, except that I saw a creature leaning over a hooded well, and, through the dark, laughed at her reflection in the green water. And in front of a hut there fluttered a fresh veil on a tilting, weather-beaten post. The women of good station and poor were distracted from the bed rails, the pitchers, the pillows grown small and brittle under their heads. Large women such as Antonina now fitted their bodices in the moonlight. The farther I strode from the city of Sasso Fettori, the better was the view of the fortress, large and silhouetted, black and irregular up there as the multi-prisoned Bastille town of Granada. What fate had it to offer the husband hunters, or the fathers also, who, had they the stock, would have busily slaughtered the hogs and cut from them the delicacies of the viscera to be served black and steaming as roasted chestnuts? To turn one's eye from the immediate rock, the cannibal briar crouched under cover of some phosphorescent leafy plant. From the immediate valley road, crooked and hard to the rider, to twist about in the saddle and back here, high, far away, see the white fortress and its stripes and shadows, black with its secrets, terraces, barred apertures, the landmark forever there, from which formerly flew pennants of the festa, now sporting crows' nests and rooks' nests over the smell of dead lions in the arena. The forest was full of activity. On all the trees, the small twigs were newly broken, and some chunks were still aglow with sparks. The donkey took me heavily through the underbrush, not starting at the fired tree trunks, but shying testily when we neared the mouth of the cave. The tunnel, polluted during the time of the fairs, was now lit by torches, pitch sticks wedged deep in the rocks. They had picked the forest bare, dancing a quadrille almost extinct in Sasso Fettori. The Donna stood before the cave, an idol whose nights were spent with a few small deer and speechless animals. The donkey turned a sharp foot, the lumbering saddle creaked, and even this far I saw the defamation. The Donna's face smeared with blood. I galloped. As I passed her, I raised my boot, and, ramming her chest, dislodged her so that she fell and rolled upon the crackle of the clearing. And there came the peculiar rush and windmilling, the sound of a bird striking in the dark, the outermost protective net of leaves, as the owl first beat his wings, attempting to penetrate to his roost at dusk.